So let's have a look. What time have we got? I make it 8 o'clock. So let's make a start. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tim Frenner. I'm the founder and curator of Adventurous Inc. Welcome to this month's live conversation with Alex Roddie, the author of this month's book. Hello, Alex.
Hi, Tim. Thank you very much for having me. Really.
That's okay. It's my pleasure. I'm going to add you in. I've probably lost you now.
Oh.
Where have you gone? There you are. Right. I'll add you in next to me. What a professional start to the evening. I'm holding up my end there brilliantly. Excellent. Right. Good stuff. So we're here with Alex to talk about this month's book, The Farthest Shore, which tells the story of his second trek along the Cape Wrath Trail in the depths of winter. Although it wasn't quite such a wintry winter as I think Alex was expecting, judging by the gear that he was carrying and had to dump halfway around. But the book was more than just, there was a reason for him heading to the remote northwest of Scotland. And we'll talk a lot about this tonight, but it was really to investigate whether you can still find solitude and escape in the wild, particularly escape from our ever-connected digital lives, which I don't think you mind me saying, Alex, you felt that it was starting to provoke a little bit of anxiety, and you thought maybe if I get away from it all, that will solve it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, that was a big part of it. Yeah.
That was the premise. So we'll come on and discuss that in a while. But I like to work up to these. I'm sure lots of interviews they would go straight in. Right, Alex, tell me about the journey. But we want to know about more. We want to know about Alex and how he came to write this book. So we're as interested in what came before it as what happened in the book. So you clearly had quite an outdoorsy family and quite an outdoorsy upbringing. Where was the first place that you remember going outdoors and going, wow, I really like it out here?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. You know what? I don't think anyone's asked me that before. I suspect it was probably a hill above Malham in the Yorkshire Dales called Pikedoor Hill. I can't imagine anyone will have heard of it, but it's just a fairly little lump above Malham in the Yorkshire Dales. And we used to go on family holidays in the Yorkshire Dales. And my dad had always been a passionate fell walker when he was younger. He tramped all over the Yorkshire Dales. He's from Yorkshire originally. And I particularly remember one summer holiday in which he was like, right, we're going to go and climb Pikedoor Hill. And it was me, it was Dad, and it was my brother James. And we went and climbed Pikedoor Hill. And there's loads of old mine workings up there. And he was telling us stories about when he used to go and kind of prospect for, I think it was malachite and various other kind of minerals. And it really fired my imagination. I do remember feeling very, very tired for a lot of the ascent because I was quite a kind of chubby child and, I was not particularly fit. But yeah, I think that probably was the spark that set it all off.
Wow, I'm ashamed to say I don't recognise it. Is it Daw as in D-A-W?
Yeah, P-I-K-E-D-A-W. It really isn't a prominent peak, but it's just kind of visible enough from Malham on the skyline. Yeah.
That's all you need as a little kid, though, isn't it? Just that little peak. Oh, we could get up there. So did that set the tone for family holidays? Was family holidays always spent in the outdoors then?
Yeah, generally. I mean, it was pretty much always the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District that we went to. Back in the 90s when my brother and I were growing up, we'd all go and we'd take the caravan, or we'd go and do some car camping. And we had dogs as well, a couple of golden retrievers, so they were always keeping us kind of busy walking. But yeah, they were walking holidays really. And then later on, when my grandma got kind of old and infirm, my mum would have to stay at home to look after her, and sometimes Dad, me, James and the dogs would go off just for like a week. I think the last big family holiday we did like that was probably 2002 when we did a big tour of the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District, lots of kind of fell walking and stuff. So yeah, that was the background.
Fab. Well, it's clearly something that you carried on with throughout all of your life. I mean, you mentioned your dad there. and you talk about him in the book, and it's clearly a relationship that really affected you. And he sounds an incredible guy to have built and sailed his own yacht. I mean, that's an amazing thing.
Yeah, it really was, and it was part of my kind of childhood mythology. This idea that back in the 70s, he just decided he wanted to build a boat. I'm not even sure where the idea came from, to be perfectly honest. The idea of buying a boat wasn't good enough. He wanted to design and build it from scratch, and that's literally what he did. He hired pretty much a shed near Woodbridge on the River Deben in Suffolk, and he just built this thing from scratch out of bits of wood, and it was a thing of beauty. Yorrell was. I never saw it. And the kind of family legend goes is that the way it was is that this was his thing when he was kind of, a single man. And then when he met my mum, and like they did go out on the boat together, but when they moved to Cambridgeshire and decided to have kids, the boat stayed in Suffolk and he never went to the boat again. And it just stayed on the river, and nobody knows whether it rotted into the river or somebody rescued it. But that's always been, I think it was the way my grandma put it that way. It was like he set one side of his life aside and he began a new side, and he never returned to the boat again.
Wow.
Yeah. And to be honest, he never really said why he just abandoned it and moved on, but that's how it was. And again, part of my kind of childhood mythology.
But it's great to have I think, well, I'm guessing, is particularly for someone like you who is a writer and a story writer, to grow up in that environment of stories of your own that have sort of, not passed down from generation to generation, but I've never heard anyone talk about their childhood mythology before. That's brilliant.
I completely agree. And I'd never really thought about it in that way before until I started to write, and I realized that these kind of tall tales from my dad's life on the river were such an important part of my life growing up. Stories of thunderstorms and weird sightings. He, to this day, well, until the day he died, he maintained that he once saw a Russian submarine out at sea and a bloke furiously paddling out on a dinghy, to try and escape from helicopters. This is during the Cold War. So all kinds of tall tales like this.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So was it that led you into the writing? How did you move from being this outdoorsy kid into someone who thought, well, actually, I could turn this into a vocation?
Well, that's been a long road. So my writing really began when I was about 13 or 14, and I was obsessed with fantasy novels. So, like many kids, I was obsessed with The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I reread them many, many times. And I began writing fantasy stories when I was at school. I would go in my lunch break, I would go to the library, I would get a pad of paper, I would just write these terrible derivative fantasy stories, but you've got to start from somewhere. And I think the first big project was a kind of chronology of this imaginary world that I built. And it was strongly tied with map making as well. So I would draw out these maps of these fantasy worlds and then conjure up histories of all the kings that lived in the different palaces and stuff. So I think this actually naturally connected with my love for the outdoors because, of course, maps are crucial with how we engage with the outdoors. And so there's always been a landscape geographical element. But I was writing novels by the time I was 15 or 16, so kind of full-blown manuscript length novels, and they were all really bad, but I kept doing them. So by the time I was 19 and went to university, I'd written probably 7 or 8 of them, fantasy novels, sci-fi novels, really, really bad, but getting slightly better each time. So I'd already written hundreds of thousands of words of really bad fiction by the time I kind of really started to develop as a mountaineer in my late teens and early 20s. And I guess it kind of grew from there, really. I already knew how to tell a good story effectively by this point. So I went to university. I was a member of the Felon Rock Climbing Club there, lots of trips up to Scotland. And my writing kind of went into a bit of a trough for a while. I had other things to do at university, and I didn't really write very much while I was there. But then after university, I graduated. I was totally at a loss with what to do with my life. It was the 2008 financial crisis, and a lot of my peers who had graduated in computer science, they went into entry-level software jobs, and they didn't last very long because it was, the junior people got fired first, unfortunately, in the downturn. I knew I didn't want to do that anyway. I wanted to do something with the outdoors. So I got a job in Glencoe as a barman at the Clackegg Inn, and I went and lived in Glencoe for a few years, and drank a lot of beer and climbed a lot of mountains.
I was gonna ask about working there, because I wasn't quite sure as to the motivation, whether it was a purposeful thing of, I want to be a writer and I'm going to go and immerse myself where I think something might happen, or whether it was more you were climbing up there and someone said, do you want to stay and get a job? How did it come about then?
Well, how it really came about was in terms of getting the idea to specifically move to Glencoe in 2008, that summer, my brother and I had a season climbing in the Alps in Zermatt and Chamonix. And it was a chance meeting at the Schönbiel hut above Zermatt, actually, with a British woman called Zoe. And we got talking, and she mentioned that the Clackegg Inn were always hiring live-in staff. And I'd been to the Clackegg Inn before, of course, on various trips, and I knew it was this amazing kind of place. It's almost like a pocket universe where the normal rules of space and time and everything don't apply. So I already knew it was this magical place surrounded by mountains. And Zoe said, if you're at a loss as to what to do, because I was, this trip to the Alps was immediately after graduating. And I thought, right, I'm going to figure out what to do with my life on this trip, which is laughable. Nobody can figure out what to do with their life, on this trip to the Alps immediately after graduating. But Zoe said, you should just go and work there for a while. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea. And then when I got back home, I found out that a former uni friend of mine, Rachel, she had actually gone and done that. So I thought, well, actually, maybe I'll go and do that then. Somebody I know works there. It's been suggested. It's obviously fate. But yeah, in terms of the connection with writing, that wasn't really something I consciously thought about then. It was literally just the call to adventure. I knew I wanted to immerse myself in the outdoors. I knew that I definitely wanted to write, but my fiction was at a low ebb at that point, and I didn't really know what I wanted to write about. And in terms of outdoor writing, at that point, it was pretty much just blogging. It was very, very casual blogging, and so it was more, I'll go and live there for a bit, and I'll see what happens.
Fab. I wish someone had told me at a similar age that the Clackegg were always taking on staff. I'd have been there in a shot.
Oh yeah.
As it was, I ended up in Coventry, which is about as far from the mountains as you.
Oh.
It was quite close to. It was quite close to Wales. I can't complain. So, as an outdoor writer, I wonder how if you started out as a blogger, you must have gone through that time when you're thinking, right, I can go out and I can write about this, and it's exciting, isn't it? And you go, all right, I'm gonna make something of this, and I'll take some photos and I'll put it on the internet, and that's exciting. At what point did you reach that point where you all of a sudden you realized that you were always creating content, and that became a thing?
Yeah, it was actually pretty much in that first year in Glencoe, I think. The blog, so previously I was just blogging on a personal blog. I think it was called Alex's Writing Journal or something, long defunct now. But within that first few months of moving to Glencoe, I'd started a new blog called Glencoe Mountaineer, which became quite popular quite quickly. So I was posting conditions reports. So I did a lot of winter mountaineering, and you need to know a lot about what the snow's doing, where the avalanche risk is, where conditions are good. And I was posting Glencoe Mountaineer, and I was blogging regularly after every trip. Just kind of short updates with photos. But yeah, I soon realized that this was an integral part of it for me. It was the storytelling that went with it. And particularly because a lot of my adventures in those first couple of years did have quite a theatrical kind of slant to them. So there were a lot of ridiculous escapades and epics and things that made really good stories. And at the time, I didn't really know how to make good stories out of them. And it's only much later that I've really figured out that actually, yeah, they were crazy things to happen, and only much later have I figured out how to tell stories about them.
Come on, then you can't come on and drop something like that into conversation without expanding upon your favourite story from that time.
Oh, favourite stories, right? So it must be the Pinnacle Face incident. So there was a legendary climb above the Clackegg that I could see from my bedroom window, in fact, called the Pinnacle Face. So there was a cliff called the West Face of the Annick, which I was obsessed with. It's this kind of scrappy, very, very complex crag with all kinds of routes all over it. And in fact, let me just grab my notebook. So I've got this is the logbook that I kept when I was there. I've got a plan here somewhere that I drew of the face with all the routes that I've done on it. Must be here somewhere. But yeah, this crag was very, very complex, and I became obsessed with it. And the Pinnacle Face was probably, here we go. Right. So this is the diagram I ended up drawing of the face when I was there. With all, you can see how complicated it is.
Yeah, brilliant.
Is that focusing on it?
Yeah, it's perfect.
With all these kind of terraces that go along where you can access different bits of the wall, and it's very complicated to get from the bottom to the top. So I did a lot of exploring. A lot of the routes on there weren't really kind of fully explored, or if they were explored, nobody had bothered to record them. But the Pinnacle Face was the one that had obtained this legendary status amongst Clackegg staff members because a lot of people had failed to get up it, basically. And I'd formed a climbing partnership with a guy called Mike Martin, who was a much better climber than me. And this is never really a good recipe for a happy climbing partnership. If you're rubbish and you're climbing with somebody who's very, very good and very, very ambitious. And it didn't start well because we got massively drunk the night before, and we set out really, really late in the morning. Conditions were terrible. There wasn't enough snow on the rocks. And we had a bar shift that we had to get to. I think it was 5 p.m. And we thought we could do it because, like the walk-in's not that far. The walk down's not that far. It'll be fine. And it was just one of these epics where everything went wrong. Everything took 5 times as long as it should do. I ended up with a massive cut above my eyebrow because one of my ice axes popped off a hold and the adze just slammed straight into my head. I think I ended up spending 2 hours leading one of the pitches. And then when we got to the top, all of the possible routes off were avalanche prone. It wasn't safe to go anywhere from the top of this route. So we were kind of stuck on the top of this buttress looking around. All the slopes were just obviously lethal. And we thought, well, we'll just have to abseil back down this multi-pitch route. And I think it was 4 p.m. by this point. We got back down to the pub at, I think it was 2 a.m. So obviously long after the pub had shut, let alone actually getting in there back there in time for our bar shift. So that was a fairly good example of the kind of things that happened. Mike ended up losing most of his brand new climbing rack on the route. So the abseil down was horrendous. Lots of diagonal abseils. So, obviously you have to leave items of gear behind for anchors. And he got one of his ropes jammed. We spent half an hour trying to free it in the dark. And it was just an absolute nightmare.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So, Alex, I think it's fairly safe to say you're quite an experienced mountaineer, aren't you? Really, and that's clearly stood you in good stead. Where you mentioned the Alps there. Where's your go-to place then? Where's the place that you really like to get out to?
Well, these days it's probably the Cairngorms, to be honest. So I've spent a lot of time in the Scottish Highlands, obviously over the West Coast, particularly when I lived in Glencoe. But since moving away, in fact, particularly really the last 5 or 6 years, I keep going back to the Cairngorms for long walks and winter mountaineering, especially. It's just the sheer scale of the place. And although there aren't really any kind of soaring peaks or really kind of dramatic landforms necessarily, it really gets under your skin. There's just something about it, I think. So I've been spending a lot of time there.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so, experienced mountaineer and experienced writer. So you write for both the great outdoors and edit in Sidetracked.
Yeah.
You obviously do other editing work. We talked before about Wanderlust Alps and the Wanderlust books from Gestalten. What I didn't realize until we had the conversation before this is that you also work as a manuscript editor. So you work with other writers to help them tell their story.
Yeah, that's right.
All of which makes you quite a well-rounded, and I think that explains to me why the story really sings and pops. Actually, it just seems to have something about it, the way that you bring your experiences to life. Is there a particular technique to how you do that?
Ooh,
sorry, I know that's a ridiculous question.
That's a good question. I would describe my technique as being very intuitive. So some editors and writers are quite methodical with the way they do things, and they use specific techniques, but I've always been highly intuitive. So I can't always tell you why I do things in a particular way, but if it feels right, that's how I'll do it. So a lot of my work with Sidetrack magazine involves quite heavy editing of articles and partly rewriting them. And I will just go through it, and I will reorder things, and I will rewrite things until it feels right. And I guess that's something that's been distilled really from my experience. So when I started out, I did read a lot of kind of how-to books on, how to write, how to construct dialogue. But I guess all of that has just become innate, and I don't really think about it anymore. So if anyone were to put me on the spot and say, well, how do you structure a good plot, and how do you make a story tick, I'd probably be at a loss for words. But if I can sit there on the front of my keyboard and kind of let my mind go blank, it unfolds and it makes sense to me.
Cool. Well, I mean, it clearly works really well, because I thought that the story is great, and because you read around the subject so much.
Yeah.
How did you approach writing this book? Because I imagine you wanted to have a distinct voice, add something to the canon, not be derivative. How did you go about charting? I'd like to think that you've got a similar sort of, just the same as Pinnacle Face. I'd like to think you've got a similar sketch there that kind of goes, well, here's the memoir, and here's so and so, and I'm going to chart this path that goes up here. And how did you do it? How did you decide how to tell the story?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, I think. I mean, there was not really a physical chart, but I did do a lot of fairly targeted reading. So of course there's the outdoor books, and I'd say that some of my biggest inspirations and in that regard are kind of, Hamish Brown, who's a classic of the genre. He did a big walk over all of the Munros, and also Martin Moran. His book, The Munros in Winter, was a really key inspiration for me. He did this big record-breaking walk over all the Munros in winter. I think it was in possibly the 80s or the early 90s. I can't remember off the top of my head, but his was a supported walk. And I knew that I wanted to explore these themes of wildness and solitude. So I'd read a lot of nature writing as well. And really my idea of the book was to chart this course, as you put it, between what you think of as outdoor writing and nature writing, but also influenced by my background in technology as well. Because, I've got a degree in computer science, and one of the themes is the impact of social media and digital technology on our experience of solitude in the natural world. So I read a lot of books by writers like Cal Newport and what's his name? The author of The Shallows. Can't think of his name off the top of my head, but various books about how technology is shaping our attention. And yeah, I guess it was all of these books kind of coalesced, and I could see after I read them all and having gone and done the actual walk itself, I could see the path that I needed to follow to get the book that I wanted.
Well, the charting it out clearly. Did you read those books before you went, and then go out with this idea of sort of those three blocks, if you like, wilderness, solitude, and technology, or was it less linear than that and more mixed up?
It was less linear than that. Yeah. I mean, I've known for a while that I wanted to do something like this. And so I had been reading a number of these. Oh, that's it. I've just seen in the got Nicholas Carr. That's it. The Shallows. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I'd been reading a number of these books for a number of years. So I already knew that was vaguely what I wanted to do, but the actual narrative of the story took place in my mind. It took shape in my mind as I walked, and it was only afterwards that I thought, right, I need to do a bit more targeted reading now to kind of to hammer it into shape, as it were.
That's really interesting. Because lots of our authors talk about, I don't know, Rachel Carson and Silent Spring is the book that so many people come back to, and obviously Nan Shepherd and books like that. But I've never delved into sort of the chronology and how it fits in the thinking. So thank you for that. That's fascinating. So there is obviously a distinct angle to it, which is your wrestling with digital technology and our ever connected digital world.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little about your feelings about that as you set out on the walk? Because you tell us, how did you feel when you set out on the walk? What were you trying to discover?
So essentially, I'd known for a while that I was suffering from anxiety. So it took me a little while to figure out that's what it was. But I had a conversation with my brother, James, who has had various mental health problems for a number of years, most notably depression. And he helped me identify that what I was experiencing was a form of anxiety, but I found it difficult to figure out what the triggers were, what the causes were. Was it overwork? Was it something related to my dad's death, because he died in February 2018? That was a very challenging time, both for that reason and because I was going through an intense period in terms of my workload as well. And also, there was the idea that had begun to surface that perhaps it was being caused by my relationship with technology and the internet. It's something I've struggled with pretty much for as long as I've used this technology, even as far back as university, before smartphones even existed. I found it almost impossible to resist the urge to procrastinate on the internet. When faced with a difficult task, coursework assignment or something, I would waste time on the UK climbing forums or whatever, and I'd end up pulling all-nighters in the library just to get back ahead. And this is a problem that's recurred throughout my life ever since. And as smartphones came out and I became ever more kind of hooked into it all, and as I became a freelance editor and writer, and I needed to use social media to actually find clients and readers, it was starting to feel like the hooks were kind of getting deeper into my brain. So I thought, well, I will conduct an experiment. I will go completely offline. I will see what happens. I will find out what these triggers actually are, or at least I will just learn something more about myself. So the idea was I would hike the Cape Wrath Trail in winter, and I would carry my smartphone with me, but I would not go online with it. And as I was setting out from Arden American Point, which is my chosen starting point, I actually had quite a lot of other things to worry about. So it often didn't come to the forefront of my thoughts for a little while. So I had various gear failures to worry about. I'm sure we'll talk about them later on. I was worrying about my resupply parcels. I was worrying about the atrocious weather to begin with. And for the first few days, it didn't really impinge on my thoughts that much, but it did begin to surface, particularly as I went through Neudart, which is quite a remote part of the trail where there's no phone signal anyway. And I did start to notice myself changing. My thoughts became a lot slower and simpler. And this is something I experience on pretty much every backpacking trip, because there's always some kind of disconnection. You're always out of signal for a bit, or you need to save battery life, so you'll stick your phone in airplane mode. And yeah, but by the end, I thought I had it kind of all figured out. And yeah, I did feel very, very different by the end. And it has, to be honest, permanently changed my relationship, particularly with social media. I'm able to use it a lot more intentionally now. It doesn't really cause the problems that it used to. So job done in that respect. Yeah.
But it is so difficult, isn't it? When you are, it's not like you've got a regular day job that you can go and work in a factory and you don't need to be online. Your profession demands that you are out there building a profile, engaging with others. It's almost, you know, it's sort of built in there, which makes it all the more difficult.
That is the challenge, yeah. And you know, I for the longest time, I kind of thought, well, I don't really need to be on Twitter. I don't really need to be on Instagram. But you kind of do. If you're somebody like me, it's very difficult to function as a competitive writer and editor if you don't have a presence on these platforms. But the point is, we can be intentional with how we use them, and there are different ways we can use them, and there's positive ways of using them and negative ways. That's one thing I've learned.
I think that idea of being more intentional is really powerful, because I loved the way that you teased out the specifics of what the problem was. So you talked about fragmented attention span, compulsive thinking. There's a lovely line very early on when you'd crested the ridge. And then it says, then piercing through the moment like a knife, I felt a familiar tidal tug from somewhere deep in my brainstem, the impulse to take a photo and stick it up on social media. And there's lots of just absolutely shining jewels of writing in there that really bring that to life. And that's an experience that I'm sure most of us have had. But when you read about it in a book in this sort of way, you just like, yeah, I've been there. And then knowing that you've been through this process and you've come out the other end being more intentional, I think is brilliant. And it kind of gives us hope. It gives us all hope, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is the thing. You don't have to just go with the flow. This is the main thing that I learned, you know, that because of course the corporations that run social networks are not benign. You know, that social networks can be used for very positive ends. You know, many people do use them incredibly positively, but the corporations that run them don't have our best interests at heart, so they have all these mechanisms in place to try and trap our attention. And I think it's just literally being aware of that and being aware of our own responses and the ways in which we're vulnerable, and then just deciding to be intentional and to use the social networks positively. That makes all the difference in the world. Just being aware of it all, you know, rather than just going with the flow and then worrying about how it's affecting you. But you can learn about it. You can learn about it. You can learn about your own responses to it, and then you can change your responses to it. That's the key lesson, I think.
Amazing. That's such a great takeaway for everyone. Thank you. That's really useful. One of the things that you talk about when you're out there is kind of the sort of the trendy notion that you can just head out into the outdoors and all will be well. And I think you did start to challenge that, didn't you? I don't think you're making a simple argument that, oh, being outdoors solved it for me. Could you maybe sort of tease out both aspects of that, sort of why it wasn't just about being outdoors, but also how being outdoors doesn't take away all your worries and your anxiety?
Yeah, sure. So this is something I think about a lot, because there is a notion that is often, you'll often see it expressed both on social media and in articles, that the outdoors is this kind of almost a cure-all for many mental health problems. And, you know, sometimes it's expressed more in a more nuanced way, but sometimes it's just a very simple, you know, get outside and all will be well. And I've never really held with that. I think partly because of the experience that my brother went through. So he suffered from a very severe eating disorder when he was a teenager. He was hospitalized for anorexia, and he was told he'd never climb a mountain again. And this, I think, rubbed him up the wrong way. So he really dived into his mountaineering. He also came and lived and worked at the Clackaig Inn for a while. And in fact, he still lives in Scotland. He never moved away. But the point is that his route out of that was increasingly risky solo climbing. So he figured out that solo climbing and intense exercise made him feel good. And he essentially kept chasing it. And he went to a very dark place, really. He was soloing incredibly difficult routes because it improved his mental health. But obviously, in terms of his physical safety, it was going to come to an end at some point. So he had to change his approach to everything, and he took up wildlife photography and caving, ironically enough, of all things. But yeah, it's always been very, very complicated for him. And particularly on my Winter Cape Wrath Trail, it really wasn't a simple case of, being on the trail was this sublime experience, because there were so many stresses and things to worry about. As I've already mentioned at the start, the gear failures and worrying about resupply parcels. And best backpacking can be a really simple pleasure in which everything is much less complicated than everyday life, and you can just experience these amazing benefits for your mental health. But it's not always like that, and sometimes there's a lot of pressure as well. Particularly if you post about your adventures on social media. There's the pressure to get a good picture that looks good online, and there's the fear of missing out. I mean, I've experienced this a lot this year, actually. Well, ever since the pandemic, I think a lot of people have. People who live close to the mountains were able to get out, during various periods of restrictions, and they were experiencing the lovely cloud inversions and the Brocken spectres and everything else. And the rest of us are sitting there at home thinking, well, this is rubbish. So it's a very complex. It's a very complex subject. It's a real melting pot, and yeah, and I just think that we need to treat it in a more nuanced way and just recognize that, yes, obviously going outdoors can be tremendously beneficial for our mental health, but don't beat yourself up if it's not on any given day.
I guess almost what you're saying about both aspects of the digital world and the outdoor world is that neither is good or bad. It's about the intention and the use that you put it to. Exactly.
And really the whole experience was, if it can be distilled down into one concept, it was just everything's more nuanced than you think, to be honest.
And I know you've used, so we've joked about the difficulties of talking about this using digital mediums, and you shared a great term with me that I'd not come across before about everything being entangled, and that it's so hard in this modern world to pick apart the threads. Do you want to share a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the phrase "the entanglement" is something I came across a number of years ago. I can't remember which blog I read it on, but it's this idea that as the modern world becomes increasingly enmeshed in digital systems, everything does become more entangled in everything else, and more complicated, and not just more complicated, but quite often more complicated than it needs to be. So, for example, in software development, because I've got this background in computer science, computers now are vastly more powerful than they were 20 years ago, but they still do basically the same things. And there's almost this arms race of software having to keep up with the advances in hardware, and you can see this playing out all over the world in all kinds of different systems. Everything gets more and more kind of enmeshed with each other, with other parts of the overall system, more and more entangled. And that's the same with our place in all this as well. A new social network comes out, and people think, well, do I need to be involved with this? And there's always this period of wondering, well, I'll wait to see if my friends are on there, or I'll wait to see if a critical mass of potential readers are on there before joining, and then you'll join, and then it'll use up a bit more of your attention and time, and it might well be beneficial. But again, you're slightly more entangled, and everything's just a little bit more complex than it was before. And yeah, once you're aware of it, that this is everywhere.
It is, so I think it takes you back to the thing that you were saying again about being intentional about why we do the things, and being a bit more questioning, but not trying to take some sort of sackcloth and ashes. Actually, I'm going to get rid of it all, because
exactly, yeah, because that doesn't help anyone. I've been through that kind of thought process myself. I understand the urge sometimes when the anxiety is there to kind of burn it all down and step away from the internet entirely. It doesn't help. It doesn't help, just, yeah, as you say, just be intentional.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to ask one more question about your reflections on the digital side of things, but then we're going to get on and talk about the journey. So I'm sure everyone's been very quiet so far. Maybe it's because I've not asked anyone, but this is a conversation for us all. So if anyone's got any questions that they want to chip in and ask Alex about the journey, any aspects of that, add them into the chat, and I will try and throw them into our conversation as best I can. So yeah, do feel free to ask your own questions. But I guess the final thing, after reading all those other books, doing the journey, writing your own book, sharing it with the world, has your reflection on all of the things that you started out to investigate, has it changed? Can you kind of share where you've got to on all of that?
Yeah, so in the conclusion for the Farthest Shore, I've got a little bit called the manifesto, in which I just set out a few simple points of the things that I learned and how to use technology more intentionally in the outdoors. And yeah, my stance on all that has evolved a little bit since, because I finished writing the book in, I think it was late 2019 or possibly early 2020, and I submitted it. So I submitted it to my publisher, quite a while ago. And of course, COVID and lockdowns and everything else, they've changed a lot of things for loads of people. And social media has been an absolute lifeline for keeping in touch with friends and family and far-flung colleagues. And I think its role has changed subtly for everyone, really. But I've become far more positive about it, really. I mean, the learning process outlined in the Farthest Shore was really a process of coming to terms with my relationship with social media and learning to use it more positively. But even since then, I think I've become a lot less cynical, and I've stopped reading those books about the evils of social media, to be honest, because I feel like I've read as much as I need to read on it now. And sometimes when you read a lot of stuff like that, you go into that downward thought spiral of thinking, well, it's all rubbish and I should just go and live in a cave. So and ultimately I've met so many incredible people online, and the relationships that we have with people, some that we only know online, can be incredibly valuable. Even if you never meet people in the real world, or in many cases, you've gotten to know somebody a bit online, and then you meet them in the real world, and you've already got that kind of shared history. So I'm not cynical about it anymore. I've made a deliberate decision not to be cynical.
No, I think that's fab.
Yeah,
but it's a well thought through conclusion. I can see the questions are coming in. Right, let's talk about the trail. So Alex, tell us about the Cape Wrath Trail. For anyone who's never heard of the Cape Wrath Trail, what is the Cape Wrath Trail?
Sure. So it's commonly cited as the UK's most challenging long distance hike, but it's not a formal trail. So unlike trails like the Pennine Way and the West Highland Way, which are signposted and have a single kind of official route, Cape Wrath Trail, it's very informal. So the official starting point is Fort William in the West Highlands, and it finishes at Cape Wrath, which is the farthest northwest point of the British mainland. And you're pretty much free to go wherever you want between these 2 points. But there are a number of established routes that have become, generally accepted over the years, generally because they're the best balance between wildness and quality mountain scenery and just being possible to walk. But there are many sections where there just aren't any paths, or at least there weren't the first time I hiked it in 2015. It has become more popular since then, partly my fault for having written a lot about it back in the day. But it wasn't just me. That other writers went and did it in 2015 and 2016 and wrote about it. So it's just had an uptick in popularity. But the great thing about the trail is that it does steer fairly kind of well between areas where there's villages and roads and things. So it maintains this illusion of great wildness as it goes north. And it strings together a lot of bothies as well. So these are informal mountain shelters where you can go and get shelter from the elements for free and meet like-minded people and have a dram of whiskey by the fire. And bothies, in my opinion, are one of the best things about UK outdoor culture. So that doing this walk, I mean, the official route is about 250 miles. Doing this walk, stringing together so many bothies is just absolute magic. But the route that I picked in early 2019 for my February trip began at Ardnamurchan Point, which added a fair chunk of distance onto the start. And the reason for that is I just like the symmetry of this lighthouse to lighthouse walk. And Ardnamurchan Point is pretty much the westernmost point of Scotland. I think the true westernmost point is a headland very nearby, but you've got this lighthouse to lighthouse, and I wanted to explore Ardnamurchan a bit. So yeah, you've got this big long distance trail. There's not any mountain peaks in the way unless you want there to be, but there's lots of kind of passes that go up to about 600 meters, lots of kind of bog stomping and heather bashing and river crossings, which can be problematic at times, especially in winter. Lots of wild landscapes. It's beautiful.
And it's amazing the amount of people who've shared with me since I've sent them the book that it's a special trail for them. They've done it. They're planning on doing it. It surprised me actually how many people have got their own connection to it. You mentioned the bothies there, and I'm a big fan of the bothy. I completely agree. I think they are a real unique part of UK mountain culture and outdoor culture. And I love the way that on the trail they sort of become stopping off places where you bump into people again, like the Young Guy Sky. And there's a question from Feasts and Fables in there about what you think about about mentoring as being something that we can get more involved in to help more young people understand what they're doing. And to be fair, he sounded like he was having a whale of a time out on the trail.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Sky was one of the most memorable encounters. So this young lad hiking from Land's End to John O'Groats through the Cape Wrath Trail in winter. And I did feel a slight sense of responsibility towards him, to be honest, because I knew that I was a lot more experienced than he was. And particularly when we first met, I found it difficult to judge how experienced he was, because I knew that when I was 19, was he 19 or was he 17 at the time? He was in his teens anyway. I think it was 17 actually, but I knew that when I was that age, I thought I was a lot more experienced than I actually was. So I guess I maybe projected my former self on him to begin with, but I soon figured out that he pretty much had his head screwed on the right way. But it was challenging to, particularly as we met several times on the way north, it was challenging. I didn't want to be condescending when I was giving advice, because he asked me several times about the trail and what he should expect. And I didn't want to kind of assume too much as well. But at the same time, I was aware that I had a certain responsibility to impart some of my knowledge. It's that fine balance between uncertainty and an adventure, isn't it? You don't want to leave somebody to completely fend for themselves if you know they're about to go across a horrendous river crossing and potentially drown. But at the same time, you don't want to say, well, if you go that way, there's just an easy path. It's a balance between the two.
And I think you struck it well. You had quite an interesting. It wasn't in one of the bothies, but there was an interesting encounter with a couple who recognised who you were as well, and that must have been a. I know you adapted that a bit to make it fit into the book, but that must have been a strange thing to experience and then work out how to fit it into the book.
It was a little bit strange. So that was in the hostel, wasn't it, at Inverleigh? And it does happen to me occasionally. It's not common, I'm not a mountain celebrity or anything, but very occasionally I will get recognised on the hill. On that particular occasion, one of the members of the couple was reading through a copy of TGO magazine, and they'd been reading something that I'd written. It was something that I knew I had to work into the book somehow. And I decided to make it this conversation about anxiety because it kind of crystallized a lot of these thoughts and surfaced them in the book, I suppose. Yeah.
Charles asked a good question there. And I think you were starting to answer it there about how you juggled sort of the philosophical points you're raising with the adventure tale and how you flip between the two different parts of it.
Yeah, that was quite intuitive again, I'd say. So that because of my writing style, it's not something I consciously thought about, but I often visualize narratives almost like a solar system. So this is just like a little mental trick that I use in order to get the balance right. So there'll be various elements in a piece, any kind of piece. Be it book length or a sidetrack feature that I'm editing, and I will visualize them as planets or asteroids, and each particular element will have a particular gravitational mass, and I'll just try and get everything nicely balanced. That's, unless I want something to have an overwhelming influence on it, in which case I will let it have more of an influence. But again, it's fairly intuitive, I'd say.
I think that's fab, and I'm sure we've all got this image of you with this solar system inside your head. So obviously you purposely chose to do the trail in winter, but it didn't really pan out like a winter trail, did it? That must have been a bit of an odd experience. It
was an odd experience because I really had this idea in my mind of what the trail would be like. I had been inspired by the blogs of some people who'd done sections of the Cape Wrath Trail in genuine winter conditions before, and you've got these amazing images of snowy camps and long kind of days on snowshoes over this snow-covered landscape. And I absolutely love winter mountaineering and backpacking in winter as well, particularly in the Cairngorms. And I had this idea of what I thought the trail would be like, and it turned out to be nothing like that. So there had been a fairly big dump of snow, I think a couple of weeks before I set out, but it pretty much all melted days before I began from Ardnamurchan Point. So I think it was literally about 2 days before I set out. There was a massive thaw, and I saw very little snow until I got to Glenfinnan after quite a few days. And at Glenfinnan, the temperature did drop a bit, and it snowed a fair distance down the mountain. And when I got to Glenfinnan, I had to wait for my brother to bring up some replacement equipment. So I decided to go up into the hills and do some Munros while I was there. And that was really my only taste of genuine winter on the whole trip. So I went up and climbed, I think it's Sgurnacorrach and Sgurthulm above the bothy there. Beautiful winter conditions. And I just remember being up on the ridge and watching the wind sculpt the sastrugi in the snow there, and just feeling really grateful that I'd managed to see any proper winter at all. But after that, it was pretty much either wind and rain or kind of unseasonal warmth and sunshine. It felt much more like, so my first Cape Wrath Trail had been in June 2015, and I think it's a line in the book that I wrote that my February trip felt more like June, and my June trip had felt more like February, because that June had been very wet and cold, and there was actually a lot more snow on that first so-called summer trip. So it was very strange. It felt almost upside down, the whole experience, and I had more clothing than I needed. My hiking trousers were much too warm. I had these kind of paramo, kind of double-layered paramo trousers, and I ended up unzipping them almost down to the ankle by the end of the trip because I was so overheating. Yeah.
Not to mention the winter mountaineering boots that you carted around for half the way
Yeah.
until
Yeah.
you
It
got rid
was.
of them.
Oh, it was really problematic, to be honest, because of course I never knew when winter might come back. And there's sections of relative high ground not far from the end. So, when I'm 100 miles in or so, thinking, well, there's no winter now, but maybe there will be in a week. What do you do? To be honest, if I were doing it again now, I probably would swap them out for trail shoes as soon as I realized that genuine winter conditions weren't forthcoming. And I would just make do with trail shoes and micro spikes because I'm more comfortable doing that in snowy conditions now. But I sometimes find that if you're in the mentality of being a winter mountaineer with the big pack and all the other stuff, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I can't really do between the two. I have to either be in winter mountaineer mode or ultralight backpacking mode. I find it very difficult to steer a course between the two.
Talking about backpacking mode, Charlotte was very curious to find out what happened to the tent with its own internal rain system.
Oh, right. Well, that one I actually donated to my niece, Ada. So she is 4 and she loves the outdoors, and I figured that she can have a tent for playing into the garden. I did tell her mother though that it won't hold up to a rainstorm.
I think I'm the exact opposite, Alex. I've got a tent which basically looks like a toy tent.
Right.
I slept in on Ilkley Moor not last night, the night before.
Oh, right.
I didn't think it wasn't really going to hold up to it, but it did in the end. It's beautiful. It's white. It's got very colourful flower patterns all over it. I'm sure it'll go down a storm in the gear pages of the Great Outdoors.
Yeah.
But it did stand up to a night on Ilkley Moor, and I was very proud of my little tent.
Excellent.
I've had it for a while. I need to keep using it until it dies, and then when it dies, I'll get a real tent. But until it dies, I'm fine. So which was the bit that you enjoyed the most? I can see we've got 4 minutes left. We never finish by 9 o'clock. Is that okay?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Good. And I'm sure our guest will be all right as well with a little bit of extra time. And if they've joined us yet, I don't think they have. So which was your favourite bit? Which was the bit that you really enjoyed?
So I've been asked this a few times, and I think I give a different reply every time. Today, I'm probably going to say Neudart, to be honest. It's always just so special traveling through Neudart, and particularly because that's where I started to sense the change in my thinking and the transformation from kind of scatterbrained Alex in Civilization to the Alex on the trail with the simple thoughts and much slower thoughts. And it's just, there's so much to see in Neudart, and it's one of these places where if you just looking superficially, you'll think, well, it's just a load of bare hillsides and dead trees, but there's so much more to it than that. There's layers of human history. There's the landscape itself is amazing, and the light is quite often spectacular there as well. So yeah, I'd have to say Neudart.
Have you read The Last Wilderness?
Yes, loved it. Absolutely loved it.
So hot off the press, this was the book that subscribers voted their favourite for connection last year. And obviously it starts in Neudart. So this was January's book last year. So yeah, an incredible tale of someone who clearly had a really powerful connection that when you can feel it slipping away from him as he starts to lose his hearing, he can't hear the birds that he loves so much. That was so I'm not surprised that was readers' favourite for connection.
Very powerful book that.
It is, and clearly a very special place. And so wilderness was the other thing that you were trying to get to grips with, and I was. There was a moment when you come across, I think that it was construction for a dam. Was that right? And there's quite a lot of devastation there. What was your reflection on the ability to find wilderness and the potential for us to keep wild places wild?
Yeah, so this is another really complex topic, I think, and the thinking on it in general amongst the outdoor community it goes through phases, and there's lots of different opinions on it. And with the Cape Wrath Trail in general, because it's this trail that seeks out the wild places very specifically, you know, it avoids centers of human habitation as much as possible. There is this expectation as you set out that you will experience wildness, and there is a lot of wildness, but wildness in Scotland, anywhere in the UK, is always very conditional. You know, sometimes you've got to look for it, and sometimes the landscape that appears wild is significantly less wild than it you might think it is. Like much of the Highlands, for example, the modern systems of land use with grouse shooting and deer stalking have denuded a lot of their tree cover, and that actually goes hand in hand with clearance of human populations that would once have lived much more sympathetically with the landscape. So in Knoydart, you can see that everywhere. You know, the ruins of crofts. You know, these places used to support far greater human populations, but ironically, they may have been far better for biodiversity at that time than they are now. So yeah, wildness was something I was looking for most definitely. And it does come as a shock when you come across something like a massive bulldozed road in the middle of a remote glen and then a huge hydro dam. And these things are popping up all over the place. And it's difficult to talk about them because sometimes they exist for the benefit of local communities, like small scale hydro schemes and things like that. And, you know, I'm very much of the opinion that rural communities should be able to live independently from the land that they have a connection to. You know, the alternative is clearance again and populations moving to urban centres. But at the same time, you know, sometimes it's just large estates cashing in and permanently ruining whatever wild qualities of the land may just about have clung on for century after centuries of damage and degradation. So yeah, there was that hydro scheme and access track. And the other place where it hits you as well on the Cape Wrath Trail is Glen Oikel, where there's a lot of commercial forestry. And a lot of it had been clear felled the first time I hiked the trail in 2015. And it was a real low point for me, you know, coming down out of what you imagine to be these wild mountains and seeing all these devastated timber plantations. It kind of forces you to confront the illusion of wildness. And I think the more you learn about the ecology of these places, the more you realize that, you know, this wildness is quite tenuous and it's very, very fragile.
Yeah, again, so much more complicated than you might.
Exactly, it's nuanced. Yeah, that's all about the nuance.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. Lizzie's asked a great question there, and she said, "Do you think there's a link between looking for solitude and experiencing anxiety?" I'm guessing she's meaning is one a trigger for the other?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I've thought about that actually recently, to be honest. So I think it can be. I think that when I'm going through a period of experiencing anxiety, I think the urge to find solitude can be stronger, particularly if I think that that's being triggered by too much time online or, you know, unintentional, mindless web browsing or something like that. And that was certainly the case at the start of this walk. You know, I knew that was something that had triggered it and I wanted to seek the solitude. And the other way around as well, you know, sometimes solitude can collapse into itself and form loneliness, you know, so it's everything in balance, I think. And, you know, fostering genuine human connections, talking to people over the phone, it's an antidote to all that, you know, everything in its place. I need a certain degree of solitude in order to function, a certain amount of time spent by myself in the hills and on the trail. And, you know, if I don't get that, I get cranky.
I mean, I think, you know, it's so much more complicated than can easily be reduced to simple dualities, isn't it? There was one thing that really interested me on the walk, because obviously you walk with Chris Townsend at times, and there was definitely a difference in both your approach to the wild, to your approach to gear and technology, and your as in outdoor gear, and your approach to the digital world.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure whether that was a generational thing or an attitudinal thing. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so Chris, so I've worked with Chris for a number of years, and he was also kind of a childhood hero of mine. So Chris is a very, very experienced outdoor writer. He's been writing books about the great outdoors and long distance walking since before I was born. So when I was a kid, his backpacker's handbook was literally my Bible. So it's one of these things where, you know, you don't really expect to meet your heroes. And then if you do meet your heroes, you don't really expect to become friends with them. But, you know, Chris and I have been friends for years. We've worked on TGO, loads of other projects. We often go walking together, and he's a very straightforward man. So he doesn't overcomplicate things. At least this is what I know of Chris. You know, he sees things in quite a straightforward way, and I think possibly that's because he's spent so much time on very long distance trails. I think he's internalized a lot of these lessons, and he just he lives those lessons in his everyday life, which I find absolutely admirable. But I think there is also a generational aspect to it as well. So he doesn't really have any of the same hang-ups about social media use that I do. He doesn't find these platforms problematic at all. He can use them, and they don't really affect his mental health or quality of life from what he's told me. And you know, he's an enthusiastic adopter of technology. So he was using smartphones for navigation on the hill many years ago, at a time when a lot of the kind of more conservative elements of the outdoor community were saying, well, you should never navigate with anything but map and compass. You know, Chris has always been a bit of a pioneer in that regard. And also, you know, he's just an expert in outdoor gear in general. He's helped to develop a lot of the technology and equipment we now take for granted. You know, he was basically one of the first long distance walkers from the UK to use trail shoes instead of big boots. You know, he's really been at the forefront of it all for a long time. So yeah, I always find conversations with Chris very interesting, because I often tend to overcomplicate things. And if I talk to Chris, quite often I will realize that I'm overcomplicating things.
Brilliant. No, I share that. I don't know, my our community might have their own views. I think I sometimes overcomplicate things as well. I'm trying to think a bit deeply about things. Don't comment, everyone. Don't comment. Well, you can comment if you like. You know, I'm open to it. Alex, it's been an absolute pleasure. You talked about Chris having spent a long time on the trails, and that working through into his being and his philosophy. Well, I think the same can be said for you. It's a fabulous story. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I know it won't be the last time. I always say to authors, we're not going to talk about future books, because it can go all sorts of ways. And Alex hasn't talked about future books, and even I crowbarred in his Wanderlust Alex. So that's all good. But we're not going to talk about future books, but briefly, I want to talk about past books. So we've talked about this one. So Neil Ansell was voted subscribers' favorite book for Connection last year. So this one was voted. So last year I concluded that the thing we could find in our books was meaning and connection. So Neil had the most connection. This one had the most meaning. Things I Learned from Falling, by Claire Nelson. And Claire has very kindly agreed to join us. So I'm just going to bring her in. Hello, Claire.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. So I know you haven't been here for all of the conversation, but you've probably gathered we've been chatting to Alex about his trip along the Cape Wrath Trail, and I know you're on a trail yourself. Tell us where you are, Claire.
I'm in New Zealand at the moment. I'm at my mum's house, and you've caught me in a brief window. I've been walking the Te Araroa Trail across New Zealand, and I'm about to embark and go to the South Island on Monday. And so, yeah, it's I've been upping the ante with the hiking thing in terms of, this is my first through hike. And it's not been an easy one. It's been one of disruptions and challenges. And I mean, Yeah, I'm still
tricky.
I've just come down from a bit naked.
I think you were obviously, you know, this was a really powerful book, and I know it meant a lot to readers, and they got a lot of meaning out of it, because they also voted it their favorite book of last year as well. So not only did you get all the votes for meaning, you got all the votes for connection as well.
Thank you.
I think it's a brilliant book. You know, I think it's a brilliant book, and I know that subscribers think it's a brilliant book. But I just thought there was a lovely symmetry to you heading out on your own long distance trail, looking for something, when we're here talking with Alex about who's been on a long distance trail looking for something, and there's definitely something to be found out there, isn't there? From a long period of walking, and I think Alex has clearly done a lot of that. You're coming to that to that afresh. How have you found that process of the mental state that you get into when you're out there?
Well, I mean, I was nodding very hard when Alex was talking about the fact that he needs that solitude, you know, to kind of to thrive, really. But also, you soon learn when that, as he said, collapses into loneliness. And I went on this trail, and you know, I talk about this in my book, but you know, I have this thing of fear in all the wrong places. So I had all this anxiety around my life and other people, but on my own in the wilderness, I don't tend to have any fear. And of course, that also has its problems. And I went into this trail thinking that the thing I was most nervous about was interacting with other people on the trail, and how that might affect my connection with the wilderness. But so far, I've been quite surprised that those connections with other people, which, you know, inevitably happen on a through hike, have been some of the most profound. And I really am still in the process of rethinking how I connect with both the outdoors in the wilderness and solitude, and with other people, both in and away from that environment. So it wasn't what I was expecting to, it wasn't what I was looking for going into it, let's put it that way.
And do you think you might write about your experience?
I'd like to. As I say, that's sort of something I'm looking to do at the end of this journey, but I don't know what the story's going to be. You know, I went into this thinking I want to reconnect with my homeland. You know, I write about, you know, I write about how I feel about New Zealand in that book, and that sense of just kind of always wanting to distance myself from this, you know, childhood version of myself, and now I'm coming back to it and really having to be in it. And but the story keeps changing all the time, and I keep learning and discovering new things about myself and that connection. So I don't quite know what it's going to be at the end of it. I'm making notes as I go. There's a lot already that I can write about.
And I know it's early morning where you are, Claire. So thank you very much for joining us. It meant you missed a bit at the start when Alex was sharing how he'd sort of sketched out the story that he was going to tell through his book. So you'll have to watch that again. We won't get him to go over it, but it was brilliant. And by the way, if you need someone to help with the manuscript, that's the other thing that Alex does, which is, you know, quite a skill. So there we go. We have all the best authors and the best outdoor folk in Adventurous Inc. So Claire, thank you for writing the best book that we read last year. It's official now. And Alex, thank you for writing this wonderful book. They share so much in common. I genuinely believe, and I'm sure that most of us do, that the meaning of life is out there somewhere, and by reading these books and getting out and taking that inspiration to get out there, I'm sure we will all find it as a result. So you're both an absolute inspiration. Thank you from me. Thank you from all the community. We absolutely love it. And I almost want to make the joke about you've saved us having to go out and do it, but if anything, it's the opposite. I'm sure most of us are desperate to get out there and follow in your footsteps as well as our lives and our bodies enable us to. So thank you for that. For when we can't get out there, it's good to know that you're out there doing it for us.
Thanks so much.
Right, we're going to call it a day. We're well over time. Thank you very much, everybody. I can't say hello to you all. If you've joined for the first time, I hope you've enjoyed it. This is what we do every month. We read a book, we think about what it means, and then we have a chat with the author. And they're awesome people like these guys. So brilliant. Right, I'm going to take us all off pin and we can do that wavy goodbye thing. I'm sure everyone's getting bored of the wavy goodbye thing, aren't they? I don't see that many people, so I like to do a wavy goodbye.
Yeah.
Right. Bye, everyone. Thanks a lot.